There is a grand romanticism around the challenge of scaling a mountain. It's the image of it. Olympus, the summit of the gods, the apex of man's dominion over nature. These are things to be surmounted, to act as a high throne from which we can look down on all beneath us, conquering the world, conquering the self. Man's obsession with scaling these beasts is an ascent of our own ego. To climb the highest peaks is to commune with the heavens. But for all my admittedly limited knowledge of the history and culture of climbing, I've never really seen what it would mean to live in that space. It's always seemed like the goal is to empower oneself in the face of something that does not belong to you. All my points of reference have inevitably come from foreign interests, people for whom the act of travelling to somewhere else to attempt a climb could be strongly argued at the very least an unconscious colonial act. But what happens when the mountain is your only means of survival? Your life? Your home? Would you see that climb in the same light? Jusant opens in a desert, one that quickly becomes understood to be something else entirely, a stretch of rocks and sand and detritus, explicitly a graveyard of an oceanic absence. The rusty carcasses of old boats act as markers along a journey to an inescapably gargantuan stone pillar. Almost immediately it is made clear that this mass was once occupied, a space where a community entrenched themselves among the rocks, where society built itself around the verticality of this space. They call it the Tower, and I can't think of a more appropriate name. This entity is enormous, so much so that even before the reins are handed over to the player for the first time, your avatar has completed their own sizable ascension. The ground is nothing but a distant vista, a featureless horizon of nothingness built with little more than a desire to highlight just how isolated you really are here. But the bone-dry ocean is not important, as it turns out. Your eyes are drawn ever upward. As you navigate these boulders, outcrops, cliffs and inclines, you quickly realize that there are no other people here, and even without coming across the letters and diary entries of former residents, through the long-abandoned remnants of fishing huts, netting, old boats dangling precariously from frayed mooring, it's quickly understood why. The titular Jusant, a word meaning ebb or low tide, is described in these cursory notes as an era-defining event, a massive and seemingly permanent retreating of the tide, the moment that the oceans went away, the moment that the rain fell for the last time, day zero for a new existence, one of hardship, one where the sentimentality of physical things quickly eroded in the wake of a more desperate need to adapt or find something better. You don't need to read anything to understand this. It's implicit in the environments you navigate. That transfer from maritime infrastructure to hastily assembled footholds, a story told across an era from immediate uncertainty to a more permanent understanding of the reality of this harsh new world. As you continue ever upward, the focus quickly moves away from the scale of this landmass and towards a need to understand the community that called this place home. In early chapters you are given visual indicators of how far you've come, landmarks that transform across space and time, big at first, eventually shrinking to a speck in the distance. But eventually, any sense of progress upwards gets lost in the enormity of this space, not only by divine architecture, but by the game's own design. There's a reason for this. You find yourself zigzagging through and around the various strata of the tower, and with a landscape barren of any tangible identifying features. Eventually, and with a startling rapidness, you no longer can see the ground, and it is here that you start to see the story that the game really wants to tell. Jusant isn't really about the climb. Of course, it's hard to see that at first, given that it's the primary language set, a pristine, streamlined, smooth as silk approximation of the experience of bouldering for those of us with no upper body strength and a deeply ingrained fear of heights. Sophisticated in its simplicity, it reduces the complexity of propelling one's body up sheer faces of rock and root as you attempt to move from base to summit. But when I first played Jusant, I was surprised at just how different its intent was to what I was expecting. What is the purpose of climbing a mountain? To me, it has always been the thrill of seeing the world from a wildly different perspective. To gaze upon where you've come from and understand implicitly that no matter the scale or how small you feel in the wild sprawl of the world, things are inevitably conquerable. But when that space is your home and your home is under threat, that landscape takes on a more sorrowful quality. A graveyard of a past impossible to escape and a future frighteningly uncertain. In the latter half of the game, there are no gorgeous vistas as a reward for your efforts, because the goal is far more pragmatic than that. The game often uses its vertical axis no differently to its horizontal one. The only differentiation is in how you move through it. The result of such an omission is even more rewarding. You are given ample opportunity to visit the spaces where people once lived, and as you ascend the pillar, you begin to see a story unfold, one of a community trying to figure out how to continue existing when the rules of the world suddenly change. A civilization built around the ebb and flow of water around this central pillar suddenly finds themselves without, and part of the experience of navigating this space is understanding just how much the tide was relied upon. It's not just about accessing the various strata of the tower, where flotation devices are hastily replaced with ropes, carabiners, jugs, and ladder rungs. The flow of water was also essential to farming, to the movement of resources up and down the cliffs, to the way the residents were able to communicate with one another. It's even ingrained in the way people talk about the tower. The language used throughout is predominantly maritime, not alpinist, defining this space with terms such as high tide and low tide, time measured in octaves, the mysterious whale-like creatures that had become the stuff of mythology known only as ballasts. More striking is the thought that this terminology slowly loses its context the more time passes and the higher up you climb. The tragedy of such a potent environmental paradigm shift is compounded further the more you explore. As you navigate your ascent, you come across evidence that the pillar has held the womb of humanity for many eons, as documents suggest that those who once resided here find themselves enthralled with the cultural legacy of those that came before, but also, perhaps, an answer to their current conundrum. The tower at once becomes an allegory as well as a defined physical space, an entity of historical value, home to many, many generations of families, communities who existed in communion with the earth until, one day, the rain stopped. The tide went away. A new way of living had to be hastily assembled like so many pitons hammered into the rock. While much of Jusant's story is told brilliantly through wordless environmental design, its communiques elucidate further just what happened here and how long the people of the tower endured before they finally made the decision to leave. There's also poetry, reams and reams of poetry, emotional exaltations that speak to a very pertinent need to express something vital at what must have seemed like the end of the world. These pieces of writing are brilliantly evocative, not only in how they supplement the tales of the world told through the environment, but how they capture the complicated feelings of the residents of the tower and the natural conflict that occurred within a community that genuinely did not know the right path to take. There are notes implying just how long it's been since the Jusant occurred, that suggest younger generations find the idea of water falling from the sky laughable. There are stories that highlight that people stayed in this space and tried to make things work, tried to figure out what could be done to bring the tide back, even going so far as hunting the mythological beasts they believed responsible. Some accounts point to multiple mass migrations, expeditions to seek out oases far beyond the empty sea, a source of salvation that too would likely have an expiry date. While not explicitly stated, it's fairly obvious that the protagonist has come from one of these fragile havens, maybe out of curiosity, maybe urgency, but much of what you are doing in your ascent of the tower is finding an answer to this very alarming question, and in the end, that answer is found. A solution achieved thanks to the hard graft and toil of an ancestry all but forgotten, and in its closing moments we get that source of salvation. The circumstances behind why the tides retreated are explained, ultimately little more than an allegory for climate change, but it's the emotional weight of the context behind all this that elevates this particular coda to something meaningful. Joy bursting forth from the clouds, hope for the future as the credits roll. The world is saved once more. Or so it seems. Because that final chapter feels totally alien. A tower within a tower, blanketed by snow, bereft of any sense of personal inhabitants, divorced entirely from everything that came before. It almost doesn't feel real. A dream conjured up from a sudden last gasp of breath. No longer climbing the tower, you scale your way up constellations, a monolith of wholly artificial design, completely unlike anything that came before. It's a stark and evocative denouement to a game that otherwise had excelled in its grounded approach to environmental design, and I think this too is by design. One final message Jusant's creators had to offer, that some things are irreversible. When the world ends, no matter how big or small that particular world might be, it is not rock and soil we mourn, but the loss of people, the loss of life and culture. Traditions can so easily evaporate in the blink of an eye. Declarations of love and communal spirit become lost to the hostility of this new version of the world. But crucial to this particular storytelling, and the sense of optimism that springs forth, is another omission, one I already mentioned. There are no bodies. In a place explicitly in the aftermath of a world-changing event, this absence feels staggering. A sense of relief at first, but in that same bated breath, a different kind of tragedy altogether. No answers were brought to light. They never quite managed to make rain fall from the sky again, but they did find something else. Love, companionship, a new way of living, a better appreciation for what it means to be a custodian of the earth. While fantastical in setting, there is something about Jusant that I felt spoke to a very real anxiety about living in the real world, and in more ways than one, a replete sadness about the sense of community that remained fostered here. No accounts of violence, no decrees of factionalism. Some disagreements about water rationing and expedition routes, sure, but with everything said and even more unsaid, I found within Jusant a world that I wanted to be a part of, even as it was ending. The dozens of stories told within the game's journey, of hardship, of grief and salvation in finding one another, are the glue that holds everything together. The scale of the tower is impressive, but it's the minutiae of everything within it that speaks to me as one of the finest fables told within this medium. An effortlessly evocative world brought to life with artistry and a masterclass in environmental storytelling. And with that, I want to leave you with some words from the game itself, ones that capture everything I love about it. Found at a lonely lookout atop an enormous interior cavern, it reads exactly as follows. I often wonder what would have happened if the rain had returned. Would we still have met? Or would we have led parallel lives elsewhere, each of us unaware of the other's existence? As much as seeing the Great Basin dry up more with each sleep fills me with despair, I can't help but be happy by your side.